Good afternoon. Welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. The videotaping today is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Fund of the U.S. Department of the Interior through the Nebraska State Historical Society and the City of Lincoln, a certified local government. Our speaker today is Ed Zimmer. Ed has been the Historic Preservation Planner for the Lincoln Planning Department since 1985. Ed is a native of Omaha and spent a decade studying and working in Boston, earning a PhD in American Studies from Boston University in 1984. While in Massachusetts, he freelanced as a researcher and writer for clients including Peabody Museum at Harvard University, Lowell National Historic Park, and the Smithsonian Museum of American History. Ed's talk today is F.W. Fitzpatrick Revisited. Please join me in welcoming Ed Zimmer.
Thank you, Eileen. I don't quite expect that you all remember everything I said about F.W. Fitzpatrick 4 years ago. So I listened to it on YouTube the other night and I didn't remember any of it. So I'm going to do a brief recap of this individual, and then I have made some exciting, I and others made some exciting finds about Fitzpatrick since that time 4 years ago. So then I'll add in almost all the new information, the parts that I think are true. So we're with F.W., who Francis Wilford mostly went by F.W. Fitzpatrick. He was born in Montreal in 1863. Went on to his first architectural work as a draftsman in Leroy Buffington's office in Minneapolis. Buffington was quite a big deal in Minneapolis in the early 1880s and had an impressive stable of draftsmen in his office. Fitzpatrick would tell you later that he was in charge of that office at 20 years old, and it probably wasn't true. And then goes on to partner in Duluth with Oliver Traphagen, and they do, Duluth at that time is quite wealthy and doing very large buildings, and they have quite a series of work together. And then is hired as an assistant to the secretary to the supervising architect of the Treasury. And at that time and through the early 20th century, the Treasury Department built all of the federal buildings, and the supervising architect then had responsibility for post offices and courthouses and custom houses, federal buildings in Washington. They're building all over the country. And Fitzpatrick's specific responsibility was the first assistant to Mr. Cobb in Chicago, who was building the enormous post office and courthouse in Chicago. And so for most of that time, he was not in Washington, but was working from Chicago. And then after Cobb is fired and both chief assistants resign at the same time, 1903, he settles in Washington with his quite large family as a consulting architect. And in fact, he writes about what it meant to him to be a consulting architect, that he preferred people to send him their design problems because he was better at them than they were, and he would solve them for them. Also specialized in preparing renderings and had a very strong interest in fireproofing, and was a major advocate for a particular approach to fireproofing, which was encasing everything in terracotta, and was quite an opponent of reinforced concrete. And also the insurance industry thought they were both dangerous. In addition to his consulting practice, he was executive secretary for a very early organization, I think basically a lobbying group, called the International Association of Building Inspectors, and went around the country advocating for building codes. And it was published all over the country when you would visit a town and meet with the local officials and look at their code and describe the hazards of the way they were building things. He was widely published in that talk I gave 4 years ago, I called him an author, among other things. I found over 200 magazine articles and a few short books he wrote. He published in most of the architectural journals of the day, but also some of the popular press. He wrote on women's fashion. He wrote on travel and international political affairs, but also just international cultural affairs. A very prolific individual kind of in each of these endeavors. You might notice that none of those places I've identified so far are Nebraska, and none of them are Lincoln. Yet I speak about him here to the Preservation Association of Lincoln. And last time I worked at justifying that point. I will do it a little differently this time, but no Nebraska has shown up there yet in the picture. This was his advertisement for his private work, and I particularly like that his personal work's limited to plan problems, fire prevention, design, and the artistic rendering, working up of perspectives, etc. And it's the perspectives in particular that I'm going to focus on, because that seems to be what first involved him in Nebraska and then eventually brought him to practice for a time in Nebraska. Now, I hadn't realized, started looking into Fitzpatrick because the State Historical Society has about 20 of his renderings that had come to them through Anna Berlinghoff, George Berlinghoff's widow, and many of the renderings were done in the teens when Berlinghoff and Ellery Davis were in partnership from about 1910 to 1917. And many of these involved the projects of Berlinghoff and Davis. As we looked, focusing on Fitzpatrick, we find that his practice for Nebraska architects was really considerably broader than just, there's nothing shabby about being the renderer for Berlinghoff and Davis on major projects, but it really was broader than that. And the earliest Nebraska-related rendering I found, and some of these we only find in postcards or newspaper publications, but the earliest is this quite lively rendering for the J.L. Brandeis department store in downtown Omaha, designed in 1906 by John Latenzer Sr. I hadn't known that Fitzpatrick had any connection with Latenzer or any connection as early as 1906. This is probably 1905 rendering. It was published January 1st, 1906 in the Omaha Bee in a splashy edition they did of kind of a year in review with large, lovely photographs mostly of things that have been built recently and this rendering of the Brandeis building. It's hard to see the inscription. I enlarge it here, J.L. Brandeis and Sons Dry Goods Store. And on the left-hand side there, we have Fitzpatrick's signature, which occurred on some of his renderings. More often, in what I've seen, he did not sign them, or he signed them sort of covertly sometimes, and we'll get into that. But here, Fitzpatrick's signature is quite clear above the Brandeis. One thing I wanted to understand was how these renderings were used. In some accounts, by his friends, and sometimes even Fitzpatrick himself, he would say that he had won more design competitions than any other architect in the world. I think that referred to his practice of supplying other architects engaged in competitions with beautiful renderings. Most of the instances I found that I can document, they didn't win, but I'm sure that they often did. Sometimes I think it was simply promoting the building, and we find the Brandeis rendering in many postcards, several versions that clearly, by not only the building but the cars, the signature's gone, the inscription's gone, but the people walking across the street, this sort of lively tableau that Fitzpatrick most often did in the foregrounds, matches exactly to this postcard view.
Are you saying that's a drawing and not a photo?
Yes, sir. Yeah, the question is whether that's a drawing, and yes, the postcards often were colored by the publisher. His drawings were often watercolor and colored, and I'll be able to show you a few of those. But in this instance, the first I find with his signature is in a black and white or a halftone. But this is based on that rendering. This is as well, when you match up the carriages, the people walking across the street, kind of each one of these gets clipped down a little further. You turned a daytime view into a night view by painting the sky gray, putting a moon up, and painting the windows yellow. And that was a pretty common changing day into night for postcard purposes. And we find it in another published version here, just in the black and white. So we're with Latenzer. He's probably not coming to Omaha to draw that. I assume this is all by mail, that Latenzer sends something off to Fitzpatrick in Washington and gets back the rendering. Much of the connection we find in Nebraska is through Berlinghoff, and George Berlinghoff was clearly employing Fitzpatrick for rendering services before he is with Ellery Davis, because the first we find among the Historical Society's collection is a view of the Historical Society's own building, not built, but this is the one that Berlinghoff had designed for the Society that would have stood just east of the Capitol between H and J Streets on 16th, what's now called the Senator's Parking Lot. And the basement was built, but otherwise just this rendering survives of the building, and we see, rather characteristic of Fitzpatrick, imaginary buildings in the background. Most often in the background are buildings we wish we had but never were here. In a few instances, we actually see him putting a imagined building into a more realistic setting. But again, in the foreground, great cars, almost always a mix of, here in the early teens, cars and horses and buggies, and then these pedestrians who all look like they've been imported from Manhattan to stand on the street in front of the Lincoln Building and class it up. I hadn't realized 4 years ago that we also have a Ferdinand Fisk connection with Mr. Fitzpatrick, or I had just the first inkling of it, but now we can see it more strongly. The inkling came from this little picture, and this is about the size of a postage stamp in this original publication, and it's out of a 1912 Lincoln publication called Beautiful Lincoln, and it looks like a Fitzpatrick. It's got the cars, it's got the lovely handling of the building. Grace Methodist was built in the early teens at the corner of 27th and R, and it's a Ferdinand Fisk design. Matt Hansen took this little clue and ran down that the original rendering does still exist, and it's just spectacular. This is full-blown Fitzpatrick in color, in watercolor, with all of the lively elements of the horses and cars and people, the building beautifully rendered. This one is signed, and with the date 1910, which would be the beginning of the process for the church. And because this one still is extant, the church is not, but the congregation has merged and descended into other congregations in Lincoln, and they still retain this drawing, which fortunately was not in the church on its demise. We'll get to that. But we can get in close on this one and see a little bit of his wonderful detail. And what I find particularly pleasing when you actually have the renderings is you have that beautiful detail, beautiful building, and then are able to see how confidently and fluidly he could render that. Get in close on that carriage, and those wheels that look so perfect and even have the shadow on the street beneath the wheel are just a few quick strokes, just perfectly placed. The crowd hurrying up the steps, and you can kind of count each one of them and see how nicely they're dressed, are, again, a few quick strokes, just so strong and so confident. We also find something more about the use of these. I think when churches were planning a big building. They obviously had to raise some serious money, and I think probably part of going to the render was not a competition, but a fundraising notion. And we see this rendering published in the paper several times, but it has a few interesting differences. This is the 1912 publication, just about the time of the cornerstone laying. It tells us they've accepted this design. But if we look closely at it compared to the rendering that survives, that secondary entrance doesn't have a little conical tower, sort of a slightly strange, maybe Gothic element on what I think we'd have to call a very creative prairie school design overall. And the rendering gets altered and very subtly to put that little square top on that secondary tower. I wonder if the congregation wasn't a little embarrassed by how lavish the scene was, because when they actually dedicated the church, they had had the rendering toned down for their own internal publications, like this one. But at the same time, the newspaper was still pulling out its old version of the original. So the church as completed isn't exactly as completed because it was built with that big, beautiful square tower at the corner and the secondary one echoing it quite perfectly in this view, which I think is late in construction. My favorite photo of the building, and this is also where I try to weave everything I look at into one presentation, which would be a long presentation. This is a John Johnson image, the African-American photographer of Lincoln, looking at the new Grace Methodist, looking west, standing on R Street, probably at about 28th or so, looking down at the church, because R Street takes a little bend, or a little jog there at 27th. And it's just this spectacular view into that beautiful, beautiful church. You can even read the banner in the original image, and it tells you what summer event, I think out at Epworth Park, that they were advertising on their banner. Unfortunately, in 1973, the church burned down, at least for the purpose of this talk. Fortunately, the rendering was off-site at the time and did survive. The church did not. Trying to move more or less chronologically through Fitzpatrick's Nebraska connection, and so we next get to his beautiful rendering for Lincoln High School, which, when you just see the rendering, feels like Lincoln High doesn't look like that at all, but if you stand off at the right point, it does look very much like that, and lovely rendering, except that at the time the school was done, there was J Street right in front of the building and a streetcar running along J, and not quite this grand plaza effect out front. And it always looks like it has just rained, so that everybody can be seen not only once but a second time in their reflection off the gleaming streets. Or maybe that's just the streets paved with gold. I'm not sure which it is. About the same time, and this is kind of filling in a story that I've begun to understand when we first looked at Fitzpatrick. He also does a rendering for Berlinghoff and Davis of the Commercial Club building, what we might know of later as the Chamber of Commerce building, or Crane River, or today Misty's, the northeast corner of 12th and P Streets. And there are many postcards published. This is the only one I found, and rather recently, that shows the full rendering and the full inscriptions. And so we do get Lincoln Commercial Club at the right and Berlinghoff and Davis identified. This design began under Berlinghoff before he took on young Ellery Davis, but then was continued and built early years of their partnership. The postcards we more often see are clearly based on this, but they're somewhat cruder. They're the colorized version of that elaborate building. But I think we often see this postcard and wonder, well, the building didn't get built like that. Look at all those lights and the beautiful cornice. The buildings beside it didn't get built like that, but the Commercial Club really did. Pretty much all of those elements were included, at least in the first completion of it, including the balcony along the south side and the grand lights that marched across the balcony, the great big sconces that flanked each of the 3 arched doorways. And if you notice, the 11th Street light to the left reflects the fancy lights on the Commercial Club building, not the plainer street light to the right, which is the P Street light that was used all over downtown. Somehow 11th Street got special lights, and I've seen those in images now that I've looked for them, all the way from apparently up by the university down at least to M or N streets, that the length of 11th got these special lights. They also lost them rather early, and the building lost all of its lights rather early, but not before it had been published in the Rotarian magazine in 1915, and clearly based on that rendering. Right about the same time, Berlinghoff and Davis are using Fitzpatrick for some of their school work outside of Lincoln. Berlinghoff alone and then with Davis designed several high schools around the state. And one of the really eye-catching ones was the Auburn High School. And this is a postcard view, which sure looks like a Fitzpatrick. And this one, we can trace it into the local newspaper. The Nemaha County Herald was showing us the proposed new high school and telling us that they had commissioned this rendering, and when it came, they then put it up in the lobby of the post office so you could look and see what a spectacular school they would get before you went to vote at the bond election. So clearly it was a campaign piece for that purpose. What I've not found yet is a really good early photo of the school, because I know what the rendering looked like, but I wonder what the school looked like. Also, Fitzpatrick was doing a lot of the courthouse renderings for Berlinghoff and then Berlinghoff and Davis, and again, those were typically built through bond campaigns. And this was the Howard County Courthouse of 1912-13. I particularly like these two fellows on the street, and the one guy in what I think is probably Fitzpatrick's version of a Western hat. This must be a country lawyer doing business out in front of the courthouse. And we find this rendering published in the Phonograph, which was the Howard County paper, with a note below it: "Wouldn't it be a credit to Howard County to have such a substantial building for housing valuable records? Be a progressive man and get in line for that much-needed improvement." So they're beating the drum for their bond election to get this built, and using the rendering in the paper to do so. And they get it built, very much one of the handsome neoclassical Berlinghoff and Davis courthouses. It's a little surprising is at the same time, that same summer, in the Greeley Citizen, they're using the same rendering for the Greeley County Courthouse. They don't have quite as rich an inscription beneath it, but it is the proposed courthouse there as well. And they also build one not quite matching the rendering. If you remember the rendering or the Howard County Courthouse, those are engaged columns on the front, not pilasters, but doubled up. On Greeley, they turn them into pilasters. If you squint, the rendering is just about right, but both counties using the same drawing, at least in their newspapers. We have a lovely rendering in the Historical Society collection for the University Place High School, which should not look just like Jackson High to you, if you can remember that school, which the city of University Place built at what's now 48th and Adams in the teens. It didn't get built quite looking like this. I wonder if on that car in the foreground, where you can see kind of a white gash on the radiator, that's where Fitzpatrick often signed his name when he apparently didn't have the agreement that he could put his name right on the drawing. Many Fitzpatrick cars appear in these images, and then some of them get scuffed off. And on this rendering, that is kind of a scuffed off area on the watercolor. Have found since this time there was a competition for the school. There were submissions from Berlinghoff and Davis, a Chicago architect, G.W. Ashby, submitted a plan and published it in the school board journal, a national publication, that he thought that was going to be built in University Place. But instead, A.H. Dyer and Company of Fremont got the commission and built the rather simpler, more plain Jackson High in 1912. Back to Mr. Fisk, we find in the newspaper, and this is the only version I've found so far of this, the LT&T building, the Lincoln Telephone and Telegraph building at 14th and M Streets, was designed by, or my block, what was it, on M or N?
I think it was N.
I think it was N, yeah. 14th and N, across from where the library is now. But this is a 1913 publication of the new headquarters building, and what we can see
It was M.
where the present building is.
There's actually a parking lot. It's on the northwest corner.
Okay. Northwest corner, 14th and M.
That's my memory.
And this, I'm sure, from what we can see of the figures in the foreground, that close view of the street life has all the hallmarks of Fitzpatrick as well, and doesn't look like Fisk's. Fisk was a competent draftsman, but didn't do this kind of elaborate presentation drawing. Very, very good designer, in my opinion, but this is Fitzpatrick's hand. The building gets built as 3 stories, designed by Fisk. A 4th story is soon put on the top of it, and now is gone. The earlier Lincoln Telephone building you can see in this image with the blade sign telephone on the right edge of the picture. Much smaller building where Lincoln Telephone began. Oh, and then I'm a little out of order on my Lincoln High image. This was the one before we got to the both together. But you can see in this one, clearly he would use the margins of his drawings to test his colors and clean his brushes and everything else. And it was, he had a clear idea. You can see it both on the bottom and on the left. And some of them, there's just lots of brush cleaning going on in the margins around the edges. Another extant drawing in Lincoln of a major Berlinghoff and Davis Lincoln building, the 1914 rendering for the 8-story addition to the Miller and Payne building, 13th and O, with the full inscription across. And this is one that on the car to the right-hand side, clear as a bell, says Fitzpatrick. The image still exists in Lincoln in the descendants of the Miller and Payne owners, and is a full color version, which I don't have an image of right now. But this is an image of that rendering, which gets published also in the Rotarian, also in the Star newspaper, and doesn't always render so well when we get into a newspaper onto microfilm and back off again. But we know this is that same image from all the street life and the angle. And we also found that Berlinghoff and Davis, who had a big project going on in 1915 to rebuild the Burr block into the Security Mutual building, use Fitzpatrick for that one as well, because we get this great newspaper image with his characteristic street scene and inscription across the bottom and the Berlinghoff and Davis names. This project was the one that took the 6-story Burr block of the late 1880s and gutted the south half of it and turned the 6 stories into 7 or 8, and then built a couple more stories on top. Crazy project. It was published in engineering journals of the time of how they were putting in the footings on the south half and inserting the steel right through the existing floors before they then tore it out and built. when you ask where in the building today was William Jennings Bryan's office, it would be kind of halfway between a couple floors. You can probably spiritually visit the space, but you can't sit at his desk. And you can see in the construction view, the north half of the building was still in its original form, and the engineering publication said that when they finished the south half, they would repeat the process on the north, but we have photos of the north half down to the ground. So they thought better of it after having experienced building a skyscraper in a bottle, and built the north half from ground up, somehow then achieving a very unified looking building that doesn't look at all like what really did happen there happened, with some of the stones on the south half being in their original locations, others moved around and obviously went back to the same quarry, and it would look like they used the same stonemason because there's just no variation, I think, on the limestone. And it gives us a 19-teens commercial style building in a rusticated 1880s early skyscraper texture. So it's a true hybrid, fascinating building, Berlinghoff and Davis, and they're using Fitzpatrick on their newspaper publication of it at least. And then one project that during that same span, Ellery Davis carries out independent of Berlinghoff, really on his own account. The building permit is issued to his wife Camilla, and it was owned by Ellery and Camilla, was the Floral Court Apartments on G Street between 17th and 18th on the south side. And this little rendering, not a great image, but I think has all the hallmarks, not of Davis's very competent hand, but Fitzpatrick's instead, and particularly that car cutting through the edge of the picture, not all there. It does also have the implication, and in the description writes up, that they were going to build a second rank of apartments facing it and form a court between the two. That's where First Presbyterian later builds an addition and has that ground. So only the east side of the project is built, but very handsome, interesting apartment building by Ellery Davis, 1915. But even on this personal project, when he's ready to publish it in the paper, gets a rendering by Fitzpatrick, still in Washington, D.C. at that time. A couple of the other Berlinghoff and Davis projects where they use Fitzpatrick are a couple competitions, one for the Mcleod Hotel. Lovely drawing. That little commercial building on the far right side, on the far left side, and I don't have quite high enough resolution on this, is the Fitzpatrick building. This is the one they choose and build instead. What were they thinking? But it wasn't always a winning strategy to commission a Fitzpatrick, but always a beautiful strategy. Berlinghoff and Davis even compete for an Arizona courthouse, and Fitzpatrick prepares this lovely, doesn't maybe look any more like Arizona than it looks like Nebraska, but a beautiful building, also not chosen. Then, finally, after almost 2 decades in Washington, Fitzpatrick strengthens his Nebraska connection and moves to Omaha, and becomes the head of the architectural department of Bankers Realty Investment Company, which was intending to be a stock company that was vertically integrated and would do everything from finance to design to construction to sales of commercial buildings. They began with houses, but quickly proceeded to some very large scale. They built the Blackstone Hotel. It's hard to tell exactly the moment that Fitzpatrick is working with them. He's credited typically with as architect of the Blackstone for that firm. It's built in 1917. And since he's clearly corresponding between Nebraska and Washington, he could well be doing work for bankers before he's actually settled in Omaha. He publishes about the hotel in a lavish publication about architecture in the West, all of which involves his work and Bankers Realty. That give us these great pictures of the interior of the hotel originally. The ballroom, the Oriental Cafe, which, according to the description, his teenage daughter helped him decorate, Fitzpatrick's daughter. He also draws a lovely, lovely rendering for the Yancey in Grand Island, which is built by the same real estate investment firm. Not built quite to the elaboration of the rendering, but they do get it built. He does another beautiful rendering of the very lovely and sophisticated St. Regis Apartments in Omaha, which is built and still extant in a very, very lovely residential setting. When I presented before, he had published this design as a bank for Omaha, and I couldn't find that this bank had ever been built in Omaha. And then I think it was Bob Puschendorf pointed me towards Neely, where the Atlas Bank was built, very much from Fitzpatrick's design. It's no longer a bank, but Atlas is still up there. He's been relieved of holding up the globe because I think they were afraid of the globe falling to the sidewalk. But Atlas in terracotta is still in Neely. That firm had projects much bigger than its financing and proposed hotels in several Midwestern states, mostly Nebraska, but some in Iowa and Dakotas as well. This was a project for they spun off a branch they called the North American Hotel Company, but it was still part of Bankers Realty Investment. And this was to be the Norfolk Hotel, a project that began in 1917. They began construction in 1918, hit the war years, and also I think were just vastly overextended. In 1919, Norfolk investors stormed Omaha and bought back the land that had already been excavated for the hotel and started building. They ran out of money. They brought in H.L. Stevens of Chicago, who built the Hotel Capitol in Lincoln and redesigned it as a smaller hotel. They went bankrupt in 1925, and then Epley bought it and finished it off as a successful hotel venture, and it still stands as Hotel Norfolk, but quite different from the elaborate Fitzpatrick design. North American Hotel was also going to build in Sioux City. I don't think they got as far along, and this did not get built. Berlinghoff and Davis, right about the same time that Fitzpatrick has moved to Omaha, and then the investment company kind of collapses around him. Fitzpatrick and his wife, in the last Omaha directory, he's listed as working at a art supply store in 1920 in Omaha, but in the census he's in Evanston, Illinois, living in a boarding house. Seems to reestablish himself at least to some degree in Evanston, and continues to do work in Nebraska, particularly for Berlinghoff. We have this lovely drawing, which looks like a courthouse, but as best I can tell, instead it probably is the beginning of a design for a Presbyterian church in, I think it's Schuyler. He designs it they'd lost their church to fire in 22. Berlinghoff redesigns it in 23. It isn't built, sort of like the hotels, it isn't built immediately, and finally is dedicated in 1930, and seems to be sort of it has drifted quite a ways from the rendering, but still, and looks much more like a church than a courthouse now, losing that grand central stair, but does seem to be pretty closely based on, if we kind of go from rendering to newspaper publication to the church as built. So it's maybe the stepchild of the rendering. And then this spectacular drawing for Berlinghoff, and this is one of the few of the Lincoln Fitzpatrick renderings that does seem to be quite specific to a location, although I don't know what he was doing, what Berlinghoff was having Fitzpatrick do on this corner. This would have been the southeast corner of 12th and N, and I can say that confidently because right beside it is the Lincoln Theater, the old Lincoln Theater, which was this building, but you can just see the side corner with that kind of stepped Flemish parapet, and there's even on the rendering the OLN of Lincoln, which was on the marquee of the theater. So he's given us a very specific location and that parapet as well. This is just about the time the Sharp building is being built, a block to the east of this. Whether there was some competition, something going on, I've not been able to find out what produced that drawing, but we do at least know the corner. And another very elaborate Berlinghoff through the hand of Fitzpatrick. And then finally this beautiful drawing for an apartment building. And Becky Martin had asked me at the beginning of the talk about an apartment building at 21st and Washington. It didn't come to mind looking at this drawing. Well, it might not, but it was published in the paper at the time, telling us that Anna Berlinghoff was going to build this. It had been designed by her husband, George. Their home, in fact, was immediately south of this, one house in from the corner. And it did get built. Something got built there that's clearly related to the drawing, but it isn't quite the rendering. It was going to be built, I think, as 8 apartments. I believe it was finished as 4. It's sort of the somewhat shrunken, still a fascinating early Berlinghoff building. And Anna and George moved into it from the house and lived in one of the units in their late years. And an unusual Lincoln building in commanding the corner in that way and responding to the diagonal, but not quite the fountain in the courtyard. And this drawing also has then Fitzpatrick's signature and date 1925. So we're not speculating at all on this one. And a signature that is remarkably unchanged from how he was signing something like even the Brandeis drawing of 2 decades before. So we'll leave it with the spectacular rendering rather than the fascinating but less spectacular building that was actually completed. But we can see not only a connection through Berlinghoff and Davis, but extending into additional architects like Latenzer and Fisk, and then his own personal work, even if Fitzpatrick's Nebraska residency was probably the least successful part of his professional life, when they overreached and dug lots of foundations for hotels they couldn't build. But he continued his connection even into his Evanston years. Finally, in 1931, I listed athlete as among his A words on the talk 4 years ago. Fitzpatrick was an avid tennis player and sportsman, and in the various locales he lived, he often was a member or even developer of tennis grounds. And crossing a street in Evanston with his racket in hand to go play at Northwestern, he was struck fatally by an automobile in 1931. And so that could have been struck down with a paintbrush in his hand, or any architect's drawing tool, but it was a tennis racket instead. And that's my current revisitation of Mr. Fitzpatrick. In 4 years, I'll maybe have something more to bring you, maybe not. Questions? Yes, Kim.
What's the actual size of these drawings? I mean, are they 3 feet by 6 feet, or?
They're a good large watercolor. Probably, I'm just trying to remember on this one, It's probably something like 30 by 24 or so, maybe some of them a little larger. The Miller and Payne one's quite a large drawing. I imagine, although I don't know if it still exists, that the Security Mutual looks like a really big drawing. Matt, what would you estimate the Grace Church rendering is?
Probably close to 24 by 30 or something.
Yeah, they're a large piece of paper. They're not small pieces. Wayne.
Was Fitzpatrick involved with Davis when the Stewart building was built, designed?
Question is whether Fitzpatrick was involved with Ellery Davis when Davis and Wilson designed the Stewart building in 1927. Not to the best of my knowledge. I see him connected through the Burlinghoff and Davis in the teens and on the Floral Court in 1915, which was Davis's private project. But I don't see him. And Davis, by 27, is with Wilson, and they're the leading firm in town, and they've got lots on board. I think they're probably a bigger firm by that time. But Burlinghoff's still turning to him, at least as late as 25. I've also seen, and didn't bring it into a Lincoln and Nebraska talk, there are publications of some of his other renderings from California to Louisiana to Alabama. He really did have a national practice and advertised nationally. So I like to think there are Fitzpatricks hanging in boardrooms around the country that may not even know they are Fitzpatricks.
You have to look at the cars.
Yeah, you can tell by the cars. Kim.
In this image here, there's a gentleman in the front, kind of looking down with a hat.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a very similar guy in almost every one of those pictures. Do you think that's self-portrait?
Question is whether the fellow with the hat with the aqua lining might be a self-portrait, because there seems to often be prominently placed figures. I wouldn't. The impression I get of Fitzpatrick by the writing I've read of his, which is very bold and very kind of swashbuckling, and that he'll carefully say, I didn't invent the skyscraper. Buffington back in the early 1880s had patented a skyscraper design and later sued many people unsuccessfully that he was the inventor of the skyscraper. And Fitzpatrick in his own writing would say, oh no, it rose from many different sources. It was just an American invention. Yet every community that he was in seemed to describe Fitzpatrick as, and we all know he's the inventor of the skyscraper. They got it from someone, and I think it was probably from himself. So I think he had, and he was very talented in lots and lots of areas, and I think he had the ego to go with it, and I wouldn't be surprised at him putting himself in his pictures. But we do have a nice photo portrait of him from some of his publications, and I don't quite see him, but he'd be one of the very nicely dressed gentlemen, I'm pretty sure. And they're all very nicely dressed. Well, thank you very much.